Welcome back to The Deep Dive, your shortcut to being well-informed, where we unpack the most vital insights from a stack of sources, all custom-tailored for you. Have you ever wondered why we sometimes make decisions that just, well, don't seem logical? Or why we stick to beliefs even when new evidence clearly challenges them? Today, we're diving deep into the fascinating world of how our minds actually make judgments and decisions, drawing heavily from the groundbreaking work of a Nobel laureate. We're going to pull back the curtain on the unseen forces shaping your everyday choices.
Yeah, and what's so powerful about this particular deep dive, I think, is that we're moving beyond just abstract theories. We're exploring concrete psychological discoveries from recent decades that give us a much clearer, more precise language to discuss how we think, why we sometimes stumble, and crucially, what practical steps we can take to limit the damage of less than optimal judgments. It's really about understanding the internal operating system of your mind.
Right. I have to say, I found myself constantly surprised by the revelations in this material. It really shifts your perspective. So our mission today is to explore the core ideas behind these discoveries, how our brains run on what feel like two distinct operating systems, some truly surprising biases and illusions that pop up in our thinking, and then the practical implications for your personal well-being, better decision-making, and maybe even public policy. Let's jump in. Okay, so the core idea here, which genuinely shifts how you think about thinking, is that our minds operate on two fundamental systems. It's almost like your brain has two distinct modes of operation, right? Each with its own quirks. Let's start with system one. How would you describe that one?
Right. System one is, well, it's your intuitive, automatic, lightning-fast thinking mode. It works effortlessly, almost like autopilot. Think about recognizing a familiar face in a crowd, maybe, or immediately knowing that 2 plus 2 equals 4.
Okay, instantaneous.
Exactly. It's why a chess master can instantly spot a strong move, or why you make that disgust face without even trying when you see something horrible. System one constantly generates impressions and feelings without you consciously intending to. It's always on. You can't really turn it off. For example, if you see a word in the language, your brain just reads it. You can't stop it.
That's incredibly efficient. So if system one is handling all that instant processing, what about system two? What's its role?
Okay, system two, that's your slow, effortful, and deliberate conscious thinking. This is what you engage when you're calculating something complex, like, say, 17 times 24.
Right, something you actually have to focus on.
Precisely. Or really focusing your attention when something genuinely unexpected happens. Maybe a cat barks, or, in one famous experiment, a person dressed as a gorilla crosses a basketball court, and you have to really pay attention to notice. System two is the monitor of your behavior. It's what helps you stay polite when you're maybe feeling angry, or keeps you alert during a long night drive. It essentially steps in and takes over when system one hits a wall and doesn't have an immediate, effortless answer.
That division of labor makes so much sense when you think about it. It's highly efficient, isn't it? Designed to minimize effort while optimizing performance most of the time.
It is. System one is generally very good. Its models of familiar situations are usually quite accurate, surprisingly so. But, and this is really crucial for our deep dive today, it does have systematic biases. And it has very little understanding of logic and statistics. That's where things get interesting.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I thought. There's a real physical cost to all this cognitive effort. Researchers in those famous pupil dilation experiments, they observed that during demanding mental tasks, like the add 3 task, where subjects had to constantly add 3 to a string of digits on a metronome beat,
Oh yeah, it's a tough one.
effort visibly built up, your pupil size could actually dilate by about 50% in the first 5 seconds for that add 3 task, and your heart rate would increase. It's a literal strain on your system.
Indeed, it's almost like a physiological readout of your mental exertion. It's quite amazing. Researchers could actually tell the moment a participant gave up on a mental multiplication task just by watching their pupils contract. They joke, apparently, we have a window to your soul, because that physical response was so clear.
That's amazing, and it connects perfectly to what's called the law of least effort.
Yeah.
As human beings, we instinctively avoid mental overload, right?
Absolutely.
Walking and chatting can be easy, but ask someone to mentally compute, say, 23 times 78 while strolling.
They'll stop walking.
Yeah, they'll almost certainly stop in their tracks. Complex mental work often requires stillness. It's why you often sit down to really focus on a problem.
And that concept extends even further. Psychologists like Roy Baumeister and his colleagues made a really surprising discovery.
All voluntary effort, whether it's mental, emotional, or physical, seems to draw from a shared pool of mental energy. They call this ego depletion.
Ego depletion, right?
It means if you have to force yourself to do something difficult, You'll be less able to exert self-control for the next challenge that comes along. You've used up some of your mental reserves, so to speak.
And here's the kicker, the truly astonishing part for me.
Yeah.
This mental energy isn't just a metaphor. Effortful mental activity actually consumes glucose in the nervous system.
That's right. It's a physical resource.
So the remarkable implication is, the effects of ego depletion can literally be undone by ingesting glucose, like sugar. Essentially, yes. Think about that. A physical replenishment from mental fatigue. It's quite profound. Hashtag the power of intuition and its pitfalls. So with System 1 working so effortlessly, let's explore its power and specifically something called cognitive ease. You can imagine it as a sort of mental dial that ranges from easy to strained.
Okay, a dial.
Yeah. When the dial is on easy, your mind feels that things are going smoothly, there are no immediate threats, no major news, and really no need to mobilize the more effortful System 2. Strained, on the other hand, means there's a problem, maybe something unexpected, and you need to pay closer attention, engage System 2.
And this dial, this feeling of ease, it subtly influences our judgments in truly surprising ways. For instance, familiarity breeds liking, right? And it can even create an illusion of pastness. A name like David Stenbill might seem more familiar to you just because your brain processes it more easily the second time, making it feel like you've seen it before.
Exactly. It just feels right.
And studies show that aphorisms are judged as more insightful when they rhyme.
Because they flow better, they feel easier.
Right. Even the quality of the font on a page or the type of paper can make messages more persuasive. And this blew my mind. Stock reports from firms with easy-to-pronounce names, like Artan, were given more weight by people than those with complicated names, like Tahat.
It's incredible how System 1 works with these impressions. It rarely generates a warning signal when it's unreliable because it values coherence, things fitting together smoothly. We often don't consciously know the source of our feelings of ease, and because System 2 is, well, let's say lazy, as we discussed,
Prefers not to work too hard.
right? It frequently just adopts System 1's suggestions without much scrutiny. That's why these subtle cues can be so powerful.
This leads us right into the fascinating concept of priming, which is all about these powerful unconscious influences. Priming refers to associative activation, where just one idea can evoke other ideas in a spreading cascade throughout your mental network. And the key is, this often happens silently, hidden from your conscious self.
Yeah, we see this phenomenon everywhere. For example, if you recently saw or heard the word eat, you're temporarily more likely to complete the word fragment, SOP, as SUP rather than SO.
Just because of that recent exposure.
Exactly. Or consider the ideomotor effect. Simply reading words associated with the elderly, like Florida or forgetful, actually makes people walk slower afterwards.
Get out!
Really? And conversely, if you prime people by making them walk slower, they're quicker to recognize old age words. The mind-body connection there is just striking. The implications are profound. Studies have even shown that a screensaver of floating dollar bills made people less likely to pick up pencils for a stranger.
Wow. Money makes you less helpful.
Subconsciously, perhaps. And symbolic reminders of being watched, like images of eyes on a donation box, prodded people into better behavior, all without any conscious awareness on their part.
And you might be listening and thinking, there's no way these subtle cues apply to me. I'm consciously aware of my choices. But here's the truly startling implication, isn't it?
It is. These priming phenomena arise in System 1, and you simply have no conscious access to them. Your subjective experience consists largely of the story your System 2 tells itself about what's going on, a story that often leaves out these unconscious influences entirely. It's like your mind is being gently steered in a direction you didn't consciously choose.
That unconscious steering mechanism brings us to another powerful and often exploited cognitive pitfall: anchoring. This is the disproportionate power of an initial number, even a totally irrelevant one, to influence subsequent judgments. Imagine this. Researchers once rigged a wheel of fortune that would only stop at 10 or 65. They asked participants to spin it, write down the number.
Growing, it's random.
Exactly, and then estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. What do you think happened?
Well, even though the number was obviously random, the high or low anchor from the wheel significantly influenced their estimates. Massively. This is essentially insufficient adjustment from an initial value. Think about driving too fast after coming off a highway into city street.
Right, you're still anchored to the highway speed.
Precisely. Or a teenager turning down loud music, but not quite enough to satisfy their parents. The adjustment from the initial anchor simply isn't sufficient.
And it gets even more absurd with real-world examples. Consider the question. Was Gandhi more or less than 144 years old when he died? How old was Gandhi when he died?
That's a crazy number.
It is. But even that absurdly high number acts as an anchor and subtly pulls your estimate upwards, even if you consciously know it's ridiculous.
This happens because of what's called associative coherence, a principle where your intuitive system one tries to build a consistent and believable story, even around irrelevant information like an anchor. This effect impacts everything from negotiations, where the seller's first offer acts as a powerful anchor.
Always make the first offer, they say? Or maybe not.
Well, it depends which side you're on. But it also affects public policy debates, such as setting caps on personal injury awards at an arbitrary figure like $1 million. Your mind tries to make sense of the anchor as if it's a real data point. Okay, let's explore another common mental shortcut, the availability heuristic. This is where we substitute the question of how frequent is this event with an easier question. How easy is it for instances to come to mind? And this inevitably leads to systematic errors in our judgment.
You see this play out constantly in everyday life and certainly in the news cycle. People often overestimate the risks of things that have frequent, vivid media stories, right? Like terrorism compared to more common but less dramatic causes of death, like, say, traffic accidents.
Exactly. The vividness makes it easy to recall.
And we see recurrent cycles of disaster, concern, and then growing complacency, like in earthquake preparedness, where the vivid memory of the last quake eventually fades and precautions lapse. People also tend to overestimate causes of death that are more frequently reported in the news, like strokes, over things like accidents, simply because they're more available in their memory.
And this is strongly linked to something called the effect heuristic, where risks and benefits are connected by feeling. If you like something, its risks seem low and its benefits high. This often drives what are called availability cascades, where certain events get inflated by media and public attention until they fill our TV screens and become highly salient, whether the actual statistical risk warrants it or not. It raises a really important ethical question, actually. Should policymakers protect the public from the fear of something, not only from the real dangers? The distinction is crucial.
Building on that idea of quick judgments, let's turn to the representativeness heuristic. This is essentially judging something by its similarity to a stereotype or a familiar category. Imagine the Tom W. problem. You're given a brief, maybe vague description of a graduate student described as meek and tidy, or perhaps liking corny puns, and then asked to rank the likelihood of him specializing in different graduate fields, like computer science, humanities, or law.
Right. And what often happens is that people judge Tom W. by how similar his description is to a stereotype, say, of a computer scientist, and they neglect crucial base rates. For example, there are far, far more humanities students than computer scientists in general.
And he sounds like a computer scientist.
Exactly. Even sophisticated statisticians were swayed by this, which just proves how powerful that intuitive system one judgment of similarity can be. We can't easily switch it off.
And then there's the famous Linda problem. You're told Linda is 31 years old, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice. Then you're asked, which is more probable? Linda is a bank teller, or Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. What do most people choose?
Overwhelmingly, they choose the latter, bank teller, and active in the feminist movement. Even though logically the probability of two conditions being true can never be higher than the probability of just one of them being true.
So why do we make that mistake?
It's because system one automatically generates an impression of similarity, and the combination creates a more coherent story. It fits our stereotype of Linda better, even if it's statistically less likely. Our brains just prefer a good, consistent story. We readily rely on representativeness when judging all sorts of things, whether it's leadership potential by someone's chin shape or the perceived forcefulness of their speech. So our intuitive system one is constantly seeking causes and coherent narratives, which often makes us surprisingly bad intuitive statisticians. We're not naturally good at thinking statistically. Real statistical regularities call for a different approach, one that considers what could have happened instead, recognizing that nothing in particular caused a random event to be what it is. Chance just selected it from the alternatives.
You see this play out constantly, like with the widely believed hot hand in basketball. Fans, commentators, even coaches consistently perceive patterns and causality in players' sequences of successes and misses.
He's on fire.
Right. Even though rigorous research shows these sequences are often just random fluctuations, Remember Red Auerbach, the legendary coach of the Boston Celtics? He famously dismissed this research, saying he couldn't care less about statistics, he knew what he saw.
A classic case of intuition overriding statistical reality.
Or consider the finding that cancer rates appear exceptionally high or low in certain rural, small population counties compared to dense, large population ones.
People immediately look for a local cause, right? Something in the water, maybe.
Exactly. But often, these extreme rates are simply artifacts of small sample sizes. With fewer people, you're much more likely to get statistically extreme results just by chance, both high and low. It's not necessarily a causal factor or some unique local condition.
And this is a manifestation of what's called the law of small numbers. People tend to intuitively believe that small samples are highly representative of the populations from which they're drawn. We expect patterns to emerge quickly. This leads to dramatic errors and the illusion of patterns where none actually exist. It's why you might look at a few successful small businesses and wrongly conclude small is always better, completely ignoring the vast number of small businesses that failed.
Let's revisit the cab company problem for a concrete example of how we prioritize causal stories over statistics. Imagine a cab was involved in a hit-and-run accident at night. You're told green cabs make up 85% of the city's taxis, and blue cabs are 15%. A witness identifies the cab as blue.
Okay, so the base rate strongly favors green.
Right. If you were only given that 85% statistical fact, you'd likely lean towards thinking the witness might be mistaken, and it was probably a green cab. But if you're instead told that green cab drivers cause 5 times more accidents than blue cab drivers.
Now that feels different. That's causal information.
Exactly. That's a causal fact, which immediately makes you think, those reckless green cab drivers. It creates a stereotype. We readily use causal base rates, like stereotypes, but we often neglect or underweight merely statistical facts, even if they're just as relevant. It highlights our deep bias for stories and causes over pure numbers.
That need for a story also plays a role in another elusive but crucial statistical phenomenon: regression to the mean. This is a fundamental statistical concept that tells us extreme performances are likely to be followed by more moderate ones, closer to the average. Not because of intervention necessarily, but simply due to the role of chance.
I love the flight instructor anecdote that perfectly illustrates this. Instructors observed that when they praised a really good landing, the student's next landing was often worse. And when they admonished a particularly bad landing, the next one was usually better. So they concluded, naturally,
Punishment works, praise doesn't.
exactly. Punishment worked better than reward, but they were actually just observing regression to the mean. Performance naturally improved after an unusually bad outcome and deteriorated after an unusually good one, regardless of their feedback. The extreme performance was simply an outlier, partly due to luck, and the next performance was likely to be closer to the student's average.
It's the same underlying reason we talk about things like the Sports Illustrated jinx. Athletes featured on the cover have typically just had an exceptional performance, likely aided by a significant dose of luck, which is fickle by nature. Their subsequent, more average performance isn't some kind of jinx. It's simply a regression back toward their usual level of skill and performance. Luck ran out.
So how does this apply to you, the listener? Well, if you predict a student's future GPA solely based on their incredibly precocious early reading skills, without adjusting for regression to the mean,
You're setting yourself up for disappointment.
yeah, you'll often be disappointed when their college performance turns out to be more typical, closer to the average. Recognizing this phenomenon can save you from misinterpreting a lot of what you see in the world, from sports streaks to investment returns, hashtag tagged hashtag when intuition fails, and how to tame it.
Now let's delve into why our intuition, despite its power, can consistently lead us astray. Let's start with the illusion of validity and the widespread problem of overconfidence. System 1, as we said, is designed to jump to conclusions, often from very little evidence. What's really critical to understand here is that our subjective confidence in a belief reflects the coherence of the story we construct in our minds.
How well it hangs together.
Exactly. Not the actual amount or quality of the evidence supporting it. As the source material puts it, quite starkly, poor evidence can make a very good story.
That's a profound thought, isn't it? I recall that study where Army officers assessed candidates for leadership roles. Despite being explicitly told that their predictions of a candidate's future success were statistically little better than random guesses.
They knew the predictions weren't reliable overall.
Right. But they still felt incredibly confident in their individual judgments about specific candidates. This is a classic example of the illusion of validity, that feeling that your judgment is accurate and insightful, even when the objective data suggests otherwise.
And we see this play out constantly in domains like the financial world. Stock pickers and financial advisors often feel highly skilled due to the complex analysis and effort they put in. But in efficient markets, their educated guesses are generally no more accurate than blind ones, statistically speaking. They are, in a very real sense, often ignorant of their ignorance.
What's more, experts, as Philip Tetlock's groundbreaking research on expert political judgment showed, often resist admitting they were wrong when their forecasts fail. They'll offer excuses like, oh, I was right, but just off on timing, or an unforeseeable event derailed things.
So the narrative gets adjusted to maintain the illusion of skill.
Exactly. And let's be honest, overconfidence is often socially rewarded, isn't it? The most confident experts are the ones invited onto news shows, the ones who sound most authoritative. Studies have even shown that clinicians who stated they were completely certain of a diagnosis were actually wrong about 40% of the time.
40%, that's staggering.
It really is. This highlights a crucial point. An unbiased appreciation of uncertainty is a cornerstone of rationality. But it is not what people, and indeed organizations, often want or reward. We prefer certainty, even if it's misplaced. This inherent optimism and overconfidence bring us directly to another pervasive bias that costs us dearly, both individually and collectively, the planning fallacy. This is our strong tendency to drastically underestimate the time, cost, and risks required for future projects while overestimating the benefits. Even when we have prior experience with similar tasks, you see it everywhere. From kitchen renovations costing twice as much as expected to major public work projects like railway lines going massively over budget, sometimes 106% or more. Does that sound familiar to anyone listening?
I suspect it does. A key contributor to this is something called competition neglect. Entrepreneurs, for instance, tend to focus intensely on their own brilliant plans, their own efforts, their own resources, and they systematically underestimate the competition they'll face in the marketplace. This often leads to excess market entry, too many companies chasing the same opportunity, and on average, a loss for the individual entrepreneur. They become what some have called optimistic martyrs, charging ahead with unrealistic expectations, fueled by the planning fallacy.
So if we're all prone to this planning fallacy, what's the solution? How do we get better forecasts? Well, Bent Fleibjerg, a renowned planning expert, proposed a powerful forecasting method that advises taking an outside view rather than relying solely on the typical inside view.
Right, the inside view is focusing only on the specifics of your project.
Exactly. Instead, the outside view requires you to look at the statistics of a reference class. How long have similar projects taken in the past? What were their actual costs and outcomes? This provides a much more realistic baseline, grounding your forecast in historical reality rather than just optimistic projection.
And my longtime adversarial collaborator, Gary Klein, offers a brilliant complementary strategy called the pre-mortem. It's wonderfully simple but effective. Before a major decision is formally committed, you gather a knowledgeable group and you ask them to imagine it's a year later and the project has failed, utterly failed.
Okay, embrace the failure up front.
Precisely. Then have each person individually write a brief history of that disaster, what went wrong. This simple exercise is incredibly effective at overcoming groupthink and the pressure to be optimistic. It legitimizes doubt and unleashes the collective imagination to identify potential pitfalls that might otherwise be overlooked because you're explicitly looking for what could go wrong. Let's transition now to prospect theory, a really revolutionary concept developed by Kahneman and Tversky that fundamentally changes how we understand our relationship with risk and decision-making under uncertainty. It posits that people's choices are based not on objective outcomes like dollar values, but on the subjective psychological values of those outcomes, which we call utilities or values.
And a core, incredibly powerful concept that comes out of this theory is that losses loom larger than gains. We literally feel the pain of a loss much more intensely than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. The loss aversion ratio, as it's called, is typically estimated to be somewhere between 1.5 to 2.5.
Meaning, you usually need to potentially win, say, $200 just to make taking a 50-50 gamble on losing $100 feel acceptable. That asymmetry is huge.
Think about that for a moment. It explains so much.
It really does. This loss aversion pops up in so many different situations. In the famous mug study, participants who were given a university logo mug for free demanded about twice as much money to sell it as other participants who didn't own one were willing to pay to buy it.
Just because they owned it for a few minutes.
Exactly. This is the endowment effect. We value things we own more, simply because losing them feels like Well, a loss. Interestingly, professional traders who trade frequently are often less susceptible to this bias. Loss aversion also explains our perceptions of unfairness. Raising the price of snow shovels after a big snowstorm is widely seen as unfair because it imposes a loss relative to the previous normal price. Similarly, employers cutting wages for existing workers is seen as deeply unfair, but paying new hires less for the exact same job is often considered acceptable. Why? Because the existing wage is perceived as an entitlement, a reference point, and cutting it is framed as a loss.
It even impacts how people work towards goals, doesn't it? Like those New York cab drivers, they often stop working early on good rainy days because they've hit their internal daily income target relatively easily.
They've achieved their goal, no need to push further.
But they'll work much longer hours on slow, sunny days, even if it's inefficient, specifically to avoid the loss of not hitting that same daily target. Similarly, research on golfers shows they're significantly more loss-averse regarding par. They putt more aggressively and accurately when trying to save par, avoiding a loss bogey, than when trying to make a birdie, achieving a game.
Prospect theory also describes other fascinating patterns, like the certainty effect, where we tend to underweight outcomes that are merely probable compared to outcomes that are certain. You might strongly prefer a guaranteed $910,000 over a 95% chance of winning $950,000, even though the expected value of the gamble is slightly higher. That certainty has a powerful psychological premium.
And conversely, there's the possibility effect, which makes us overweight very small probabilities when our attention is focused on them. This explains the allure of lotteries, that tiny chance of a huge win feels more significant than it statistically is. It also contributes to the heightened fear of things like terrorism compared to, say, traffic deaths, despite the vastly different probabilities. The possibility, however remote, grabs our attention.
And related to that overweighting of small probabilities is denominator neglect. This is where people tend to focus on the number of times something happens, the numerator, rather than the overall probability, which includes the denominator. For instance, people might perceive drawing a winning marble as more likely from an urn with 8 winning red marbles out of 100 total, compared to an urn with 1 winning red marble out of 10 total.
Even though 1 out of 10 is a higher probability, 10%, than 8 out of 100, 8%.
Exactly. They focus on the 8 wins versus 1 win. It's an easy way for someone with an axe to grind, as the source says, to frighten the public. Phrasing a risk as 1,000 homicides a year committed by mentally ill people sounds much more alarming than expressing it as the tiny percentage of the overall population that represents. The absolute number just feels bigger and scarier.
That leads directly to the power of framing effects, which is just remarkable. Presenting the exact same objective information in different ways can completely reverse people's preferences. Take the classic Asian disease problem. Imagine an outbreak is expected to kill 600 people. If program A is presented as saving 200 lives for sure, people tend to prefer it, risk-averse. But if program B offers a 13 chance that 600 people will be saved and a 23 chance no one will be saved, and program A is framed as 400 people will die, suddenly, people often prefer the gamble, risk-seeking.
Even though the objective outcomes are identical in both frames, saving 200 is the same as 400 dying out of 600. But framing it as lives saved makes us risk-averse, while framing it as lives lost makes us risk-seeking. Our reference point shifts.
Our moral intuitions about fairness are also deeply attached to frames. Think about tax policy. Framing it as a child exemption feels different and often fairer to people than framing the identical policy as a surcharge for being childless. The frame dictates the emotional reaction.
Absolutely.
And consider this subtle but powerful example of framing and mental accounting. If you bought a $100 ticket for a play, but when you get to the theater you realize you've lost it, would you buy another $100 ticket? Most people say no.
Right, because the cost of that play now feels like $200 in their theater mental account.
Exactly, but different scenario. You were going to buy the $100 ticket at the door, but when you open your wallet, you realize you've lost $100 in cash. Would you still buy the ticket? Most people say yes.
Because the lost cash comes out of their general revenue account, it doesn't feel like it doubles the cost of the play itself. It's the same $100 loss, but the mental accounting makes all the difference.
It's fascinating how we compartmentalize.
And perhaps the most striking real-world example of framing's power is in organ donation policies. In countries with an opt-out default setting, where you are automatically registered as a donor unless you actively check a box to opt out.
Like Austria or Belgium.
Right. You see vastly higher donation rates, often above 90%, sometimes near 99%. Compare that to countries with opt-in defaults, where you have to actively check a box to become a donor.
Like the US historically, or
Uh,
Germany.
Their rates can be incredibly low, sometimes 15% or even less, like 4% in Denmark in one study. It's the exact same choice being offered. But changing the default, changing the frame, fundamentally shifts behavior on a massive scale without actually restricting anyone's freedom to choose. The power of the default is immense.
That framing effect on organ donation is a perfect bridge into this idea of mental accounting and the infamous sunk cost fallacy. We all set up these internal mental accounts for our expenses, our projects, our investments. Driving into a blizzard to use a non-refundable basketball ticket you paid for, even when it's clearly irrational and maybe dangerous.
You feel you have to go, otherwise the money is wasted.
Exactly. That's a classic sunk cost fallacy. We're throwing good money, or time, or safety after bad, simply to avoid the psychological pain of closing that mental account with a negative balance. We hate feeling like we've wasted something we already invested.
It's a common and incredibly costly mistake, especially in business and organizational decision-making. Imagine a company that has already sunk, say, $50 million into a research project that's clearly failing. The technology isn't working out. When faced with the choice to invest an additional $60 million into it, hoping to salvage it, or to invest that same $60 million in a completely new, much more promising project,
Yeah.
what often happens?
They stick with the failing one, don't they?
All too often, yes. They fall victim to the sunk cost fallacy. They continue investing in the failing project rather than cutting their losses and accepting the sunk cost. Why? Partly because admitting the prior $50 million investment was a loss is psychologically painful, maybe even career damaging for the manager involved. It's often about avoiding that psychological pain and the admission of failure, even if it leads to much greater financial losses down the line. #tab the two selves and well-being.
Okay, now for a truly mind-bending concept from this work, one that really challenges how we think about our own happiness, our suffering, and even our memories. The idea that we actually have two distinct selves operating within us.
That's right. There's the experiencing self, which is the one who lives life moment to moment. It's the self that feels the actual joy, the pain, the boredom, the curiosity, the sensory details as they happen.
Okay, the self living in the present.
Exactly. And then there's the remembering self. This is the self who keeps score, who constructs the narrative of our lives, who edits our memories of past experiences. And crucially, it's the remembering self that makes our choices about the future, based on those edited memories.
So the one telling the story and making the decisions isn't necessarily the one who actually lived the moment.
Precisely. And this distinction is incredibly important, revealed by some fascinating, if slightly uncomfortable, experiments. Take the cold hands study. Participants had to keep their hands submerged in painfully cold water for a period. In one condition, it was 60 seconds of continuous, steady cold pain. In another condition, it was the same 60 seconds, plus an additional 30 seconds where the water temperature was raised slightly, still cold and unpleasant, but less intensely painful than before.
So the second condition involved more total time in pain, right? 90 seconds versus 60.
Correct. More total duration of discomfort. But when asked later which trial they would prefer to repeat, a significant majority chose the longer trial, the one with 90 seconds of pain.
Why would they choose more pain?
Because their remembering self preferred the memory of the experience that ended less painfully. The gradual improvement at the end made the overall memory less aversive, even though their experiencing self endured more total suffering. The end of the story mattered more than the total duration of the pain.
We saw this same effect vividly in a study involving patients undergoing colonoscopies, which can be quite uncomfortable. Patients whose procedure was deliberately prolonged slightly at the end, but with the scope held stationary, resulting in less intense discomfort right before it finished.
Even though the total duration of the procedure was longer.
Right. They retrospectively rated the entire procedure as significantly less painful than patients whose procedure ended more abruptly at a point of higher discomfort, even if the total amount of pain measured moment by moment, the hedon emitter total, was actually lower for the shorter procedure.
It perfectly illustrates two key findings: duration neglect and the peak end rule. Our retrospective assessments of experiences, the memories curated by the remembering self, are surprisingly insensitive to the overall duration of the event. We just don't factor duration in very well. Instead, these memories heavily weight two things: the moment of peak intensity, whether pleasure or pain, and how the experience felt right at the very end. These 2 points disproportionately shape our overall memory and subsequent choices.
Which means our memories of experiences, the stories we tell ourselves about our lives, don't accurately reflect the sum total of our actual experienced well-being or suffering moment by moment. That's unsettling.
It is rather unsettling. It means the self that makes decisions might be prioritizing good memories over good experiences.
So given these two selves, how do you even begin to measure actual lived well-being if you can't just ask people how happy they were overall?
That's the challenge. One method developed to try and capture the experiencing self's reality is the day reconstruction method, or DRM. Participants are asked to systematically relive their previous day in detail, breaking it down into a series of consecutive episodes like commuting, working, eating lunch, meeting friends, watching TV. And then, for each episode, they rate the feelings they experienced during it: happiness, stress, anger, enjoyment, etc. This allows for a more duration-weighted measure of their daily effect, getting closer to the experience itself rather than just relying on a general retrospective judgment filtered by the remembering self.
And what did methods like that reveal?
Well, this approach helped researchers introduce measures like the U-index, which stands for the unpleasant index. It's simply the percentage of time an individual spends in an unpleasant state during their day. It provides a more objective measure of suffering in a population. What's striking from DRM studies is that while about half of people reported experiencing an entire day without any significant unpleasantness,
That sounds nice.
it does. But a significant minority experience considerable distress for much of their day. It gives a different picture than just asking, how happy are you overall? It also revealed interesting cultural or behavioral differences. For instance, one study suggested French women derive more pleasure from eating than American women, possibly because they are less prone to combine eating with other activities. They truly noticed and savored the experience of eating rather than just multitasking through it. Their experiencing self was more engaged.
That makes sense. Attention matters.
Attention is absolutely key. And that brings us to the final major bias we'll discuss: the focusing illusion. This is a major cognitive trap and a significant contributor to miswanting. The bad choices we often make because we make errors in predicting our future happiness, what psychologists call errors in effective forecasting. The focusing illusion happens when we give vastly too much weight to one single salient factor when we're evaluating our potential overall well-being in some future situation.
The classic example always cited is about moving to California, right? People thinking they'll be much happier living in California primarily because of the good weather.
Exactly. When people, say, in the Midwest, are asked to compare their happiness to that of Californians, they tend to overestimate the happiness of Californians. Why? Because when you ask the question, the most salient difference that comes to mind is the climate. They focus on that difference, the sunshine, and neglect all the other factors that contribute to well-being, both positive and negative, like cost of living, commutes, social connections, job satisfaction, which might not differ much or could even be worse in California.
And apparently, people who actually move to California might even initially report being happier, partly because they are still focusing on that salient change, the weather, reinforcing the illusion, even if their overall day-to-day experienced well-being hasn't truly increased significantly over the long term. Their attention is simply focused on the factor they thought would make the big difference.
And this applies directly to your personal choices, too, all the time. We tend to exaggerate the long-term impact on our happiness of significant purchases, like getting a fancy new car. We vividly imagine the initial excitement, the thrill of driving it, but we drastically underestimate how quickly our attention shifts away from the car in daily life. The initial thrill fades, it becomes background, and other things occupy our thoughts and feelings. Conversely, we might underestimate the enduring value of things that demand ongoing attention and engagement, like cultivating strong social connections by, say, joining a regular poker game or a book club. These activities might consistently contribute positively to our experienced well-being over time because they command our attention regularly. The focusing illusion creates a bias towards goods and experiences that are initially exciting and grab our focus, even if they won't retain their attention value in the long term. It leads us to miswant what we think will make us happy because we focus on the wrong things when predicting the future. Hashtag outro.
So after all that, what does this all mean for you, armed with this new understanding, perhaps? We've journeyed through the intricate, sometimes counterintuitive workings of System 1 and System 2. We've uncovered the surprising ways our intuition can lead us astray through these powerful cognitive biases like anchoring, availability, representativeness. And we've confronted the often disorienting reality of things like the planning fallacy, loss aversion, and even the fact that the you who remembers your life isn't quite the same as the you who lives it.
Yeah, and if we connect all this to the bigger picture, I think it highlights that while humans are incredibly intelligent, we're not inherently rational in the way economists used to assume. We often need help, or at least awareness, to make more accurate judgments and better decisions. Understanding these biases, the patterns in our thinking, is the absolutely essential first step. It really raises an important question, doesn't it? In a world full of increasingly complex choices, how can we design our environments, our institutions, our decision-making processes to work with, rather than against, these inherent cognitive patterns?
For instance, think back to that striking opt-out versus opt-in organ donation example. Just a simple change in how an option is presented, the default setting, can have a massive impact on behavior for the better, without limiting anyone's ultimate freedom to choose. It's about being acutely aware of these hidden forces, these nudges that shape our choices constantly, and perhaps leveraging them thoughtfully for better individual and collective outcomes.
Exactly. This deep dive really shows us that our internal logic, our intuition, while powerful and efficient for many things, is demonstrably prone to systematic, predictable errors. By recognizing these patterns, we can hopefully move beyond simply reacting automatically based on our intuitive feelings or flawed memories. Instead, with some effortful System 2 intervention, perhaps helped by smartly designed systems or choice architectures, we can strive to make choices that align better with our genuine long-term interests and a more accurate understanding of the world and its probabilities.
So here's a final thought for you to mull over, perhaps using your System 2. If our fast, intuitive System 1 is constantly constructing coherent, often overconfident stories from limited, sometimes biased information, and our remembering self systematically edits and biases our view of past experiences based on peaks and ends, how much of what you currently know and believe about the world, about yourself, about your past and future is a true reflection of reality? And how much is perhaps a compelling, internally consistent narrative that your mind has effortlessly and perhaps misleadingly woven for you just to make sense of it all?